So a reminder, we are about to go into our last two panels of the Economics Forum for 2025. First, we'll go into the energy sector panel, and then we'll close on geopolitics and defence. As I mentioned briefly before the break, the energy sector discussion, I think, will pick up inevitably on some of the threads that we've just heard about in our previous panel around the environment and environmental trade-offs. But it's also no doubt going to touch on broader themes around economic resilience and economic growth, but also, I guess, resilience in a very, maybe not the macro, but the micro sense. Many businesses that I know and are looking at here in the room rely, as well as their households, on a pretty stable energy system, both in terms of supply and pricing. So all of these issues will come up, and with that, I'll hand over to you, Anna, to welcome the panel. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Matt, and I love the positioning of this panel right after the economics and environment and right before geopolitics and defence, because of course there's some strong linkages there, as well as with many of the other sessions that we've had. Delighted to welcome our panellists here. We've got Malcolm Johns, very on brand with the Genesis t-shirt there. So Malcolm has been the CEO of Genesis Energy since 2023. We've then, in the middle seat there, we've got Margaret Cooney. She is the CEO of Octopus Energy. And we have, down the end there, we've got Stuart McCall, Managing Director of Methanex New Zealand. So we've got a range of different views that will come through from our panellists, given where they're positioned currently, the businesses that they're working for, and the experience that they bring to that. I'm going to invite each of them to make some introductory remarks for a few minutes to set the scene. And then, of course, as always, I warmly invite you to put your questions through on Slido and see if they make it through the team up the back that's working on feeding them through to us, and then we'll try to pass those on to our panellists here. We're going to begin with Stuart on your intro remarks, please.
Cool. Thanks, Anna. I'd maybe just start off by the fact that, I'm slightly different to the other two sitting on the stage. We're a large energy consumer, and they'll probably be looking at a couple of comments just around that from our perspective. And maybe the first comment is around energy versus electricity. So to me, they're two very different things, and they're often confused in a lot of the discussion that we have these days. So from an electricity point of view, we've got a world-class electricity system, one that's envied around the world. It's 80 to 90% renewable. I think it's in the top 10 of OECD electricity systems around the world. To me, that's such a fantastic base to leapfrog from as we go into the transition. From an energy perspective, we're probably only about a third renewable when we look at an energy perspective basis. Now, to me, that's still really good, but it just typifies the scale of the challenge that we've got in front of us. Is we're not looking for that extra 5% to get to 100% renewable electricity. There's a 70% energy gap that we've got to transition, and to me that's a massive challenge. Second thing I just wanted to say was electricity is not just the only answer. For our business, we're one of the largest energy consumers in the country, and electrification is not really a solution for us, certainly not in New Zealand given the scale we are relative to the size of the sector. And we're not alone in that. The shipping sector, the aviation sector, they're all sectors that aren't going to be solved by electrification. So we have to be really open-minded around what solutions that we have in this transition. Shipping's a fascinating one for me because it's actually one of the biggest growth areas that we see for methanol, the product that we produce around the world. The shipping industry's really embraced methanol as a potential decarbonisation journey. Now, we started that about 10 years ago where we worked with MEN, a large engine manufacturer, about creating dual-fuel methanol engines. And we've got a fleet of about 30 ocean-going tankers. About 20 of them are dual-fuel tankers that can run on conventional marine fuels or methanol. And in the industry, the shipping industry itself, I think over the last 2-3 years, about 300 ships with dual-fuel methanol engines have been ordered, or methanol-capable ships have been on order, which is a massive growth in a short space of time. And that's the industry just sort of recognising that electricity, a lot of conventional solutions that we're looking for decarbonisation, don't work for them. And just to, sort of to signal how that transition could work, is last year we did our first zero carbon voyage on one of our tankers from the US across to Amsterdam, and that was using green methanol produced from manure in the States that was processed through our facilities to make a carbon neutral fuel. I've got to be careful when I say that. It's often said it's the first carbon neutral voyage across the Atlantic, but I keep getting reminded that yachts have been doing it for centuries, so I've got to be careful with my words there. Last thing I just want to say was just around the use of gas, and to me gas is critical in the transition. And again, I'm talking about for the next 3 decades. To me, as we move into a more intermittent or more renewable energy sector, then we need far more firming power as well. And basically gas is the best solution that we have today for providing that. And I think over the last 10 years, we've probably taken that a little bit for granted. I know from our perspective, our business has had to shut down for each of the last 4 winters to help keep the lights on in the country and divert the gas that we would normally do for making our product and put it into the electricity sector. And essentially it's the start of decarbonisation for us. Not decarbonisation, deindustrialisation for us. Because at the moment we're also only operating half of our 3 plants. So we shut down our first plant in 2021 and shut down our second plant in September last year. So to me, deindustrialisation is happening in front of our faces. And I think Cameron Bagri talked about it in the session earlier on today, is that when you see 4 years of businesses having to shut down in a row, we've got to wake up and realise there is a problem around our energy system and the resiliency of it, even though it's a world-class system. And one of the downsides of that deindustrialisation here is we've got policies that I would say some people in the room would be celebrating our business deindustrialising, reducing emissions in this country. But what actually happens I'll call it in the real world, is the change for methanol demand. So methanol demand doesn't change. So it's still being produced somewhere. And in our industry, the marginal supply for methanol is in China. And it's usually made from coal. And that production is about 5 to 6 times more emissions intensive than our business here. So by reducing our emissions here in New Zealand, we're actually increasing global emissions by about 5 to 6 million tonnes a year over the last 3 years. And I know that's not the intent of our policies, but that's what's happening in reality. And to me, as we go through this transition, we have to be really clear about the decisions we're making and the benefits of them, both for us, but also from a global perspective. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Stuart. Malcolm, can we turn to you?
Yeah, sure. Kia ora koutou, everybody. My name is Malcolm Johns. 35 years ago, hey Brendan, 35 years ago, I had my very first lecture in management in L1 just over here at the end of February. It's somewhat incredible to be back here and see how much the university has grown and progressed, but also how much this event has progressed. I decided, by the way, did a management degree here at Waikato, 28 papers, 27 Cs, 1 B, and a 9 handicap at golf when I left. So if any of the students that are watching this are worried about their grades, you can make it up later in life. Enjoy the golf while you're here. I decided in my mid-30s that being a good ancestor and the challenge of dealing with climate change was an area that I really wanted to spend the rest of my executive career applying myself to. And so I made a decision to go very much deliberately into the sectors and into the companies that faced the biggest challenges in terms of that transition. And certainly Genesis, in the context of New Zealand, faces the biggest challenge in that transition for many, many reasons. I've been at Genesis for 2 years and I've been in the energy sector for 2 years. And so one of the things I like to do is try and work out what are the first principles that we're working with here. What are the things that are the foundation stones of New Zealand's energy transition? And the first thing that's really interesting is there are no low energy wealthy countries on the planet. Energy equals wealth. Wealth doesn't come without energy. Our challenge is we've built that wealth on an energy source that needs to transition over the coming decades. The second thing is that New Zealand politically, since the 80s, certainly since the 90s, has had broad bipartisan support for running a market-based economy. And it's really important in New Zealand to remember that. We are a market-based economy because we rely on foreign investment and foreign funds to fund our economy. The second we step away from a market-based economy, it brings all sorts of complications in terms of our ability to manage sovereign risk and to encourage people to invest in a small economy at the bottom of the world. The third thing that is critical from an electricity perspective, and Stuart touched on it, is three numbers. The number's 60, the number's 95, and the number's 100. By law, Parliament has decided we will be net zero as an economy by 2050. The mathematics of that, forget about the emotions and the politics, the mathematics of that means that by 2050, at least 60% of all of our energy has to come from electricity. That's 38% today. At least 95% of that electricity has to come from renewable sources. That's about 85% today. But that electricity has to be available 100% of the time. If we're going to increase the reliance of the economy on electricity, we can't not have that energy available. It also has to be affordable, and that's something that's quite topical at the moment. And so if we look at those three numbers, 60, 95, 100, where does our challenge sit as a country? Everybody's focused on the 95. Most of the political party policy frameworks focus on the 95. New Zealand is third in the world in terms of the 95. We have more capital and more opportunity to deliver the 95 than we'll need. In fact, we have about 4 times as much as we'll need to get to 95% renewable. Our problem is demand for electricity hasn't grown in New Zealand for over a decade. So the energy sector, the electricity companies, have invested almost $5 billion on new renewable generation, and all that's done is decarbonise the electricity system. It hasn't electrified New Zealand. And that's because homes and businesses in New Zealand are not electrifying. And if you look at the last election, only one political party had demand-side policies in their energy policy statements. The challenge for New Zealand is we want to electrify, but we're not. And as a result of the combination of increased renewables in our grid and a lack of demand signal to build beyond that, our grid is becoming incredibly unstable. The volatility from hour to hour, day to day, week to week, year to year has never been higher in the electricity system because we've built new renewables and pushed the thermal generation that kept our energy system stable into retirement. And last winter was the first time that the mathematics of that didn't work anymore. We were short gas, and it turns out that when it doesn't rain, it also doesn't blow in New Zealand. So we had a rain drought and a wind drought last winter, and the amount of generation we had left to back that up just wasn't enough. And so the only thing left was for prices to go as high as they did. Now, thankfully, the structure we have in New Zealand means that 99% of all electricity users in New Zealand were protected from that very high market. It was only a small number of companies that were hurt by that very high price. In the next 2 weeks, all of the major generators will announce their half-year results. That'll be the first time you see where that's played out, because our system is designed to manage that risk on a small number of very big balance sheets. Once that's not the case, that risk goes forward to homes and businesses in New Zealand. So we have a fantastic energy system, we have a fantastic opportunity to build more renewables, but as a country we are not electrifying, and our electricity system is becoming more volatile.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think one of the most exciting things for us as we sit here as consumers is that we don't necessarily have to pay power bills anymore. So if we think about a new home, if we're building one of those homes, the cheapest solution is actually to put solar and battery on it, and a smart retailer like Octopus can help you manage your usage. We can optimise your usage around your preferences and also around what's happening on the grid. So we can use that energy from the grid when it's cheap and your solar when you're generating it, and then we can discharge your battery into the peak to support the grid when there's a lack of peak energy and also make you money. So the market is changing rapidly because technology is changing, and it's really important that we make the most of this opportunity and have the market settings that enable those parties that have the capability and incentive to harness that demand side to come into the market. If we look at the market today, it's not working well. So just to put some of the price rises in context, since 2021, wholesale electricity prices, so this is the forward curve that if you're an industrial customer or you're a retailer, you need to buy off this forward market. So those prices have remained above $150 per megawatt hour. In contrast, before 2018, they were $70 to $80. As we look out to 2028, the forward curve has prices at $200 a megawatt hour. So it's absolutely crippling. To put that in context for the average household consumer, if a $100 an hour increase flows through to the end consumer, that's $800 on your bill. If you're a user the size of PanPac, that's an increased bill of $47 million. These are not trivial increases in price, and they really demonstrate how the market isn't working well at the moment, that competition isn't working as we need it to. We're also just not getting the build-out of new generation that we need. So the Gentailers and Boston Consulting Group put out a paper called The Future Was Electric, a great piece of work that talked about what we needed to do to decarbonise the economy by 2050. That paper suggested that we needed to build 4.8 gigawatts of new renewables, and arguably that's conservative given the massive shifts with AI and energy usage. We have only built 1 gigawatt of usage. So we're well behind what the transition that's happening in other countries. If we look at our closest neighbour, Australia, they have increased their solar and wind capacity, which is the cheapest form of energy, by 290%. New Zealand, in the same 10 years, has only increased it by 53%. And, you know, if we think about the impact of this on New Zealand, it's massive. We've just heard the announcement of Kinleith's closure today, and that's, you know, jobs and communities severely impacted. It's also the lost opportunity to have growth, because obviously no business is going to set up in New Zealand if electricity prices are really high. So this idea that demand should lead supply it's not going to work. Like, we should always be customer first and thinking about how we can have those prices that attract consumers to New Zealand. And the final thing I'm worried about is we have a cost of living crisis. You know, there are so many hard-up New Zealand families that are struggling to pay their power bill, and these price increases inevitably flow through to customers over time. The solution is actually engaging in a discussion about competition reform. So one of the things that was flagged last week in the Contact merger was that we basically have a market where there's both incentive and ability to foreclose competition. So we've got the largest 4 gentailers controlling 85% of the retail market and 86% of the generation market. And that acts as a real barrier to accessing cost-competitive supply if you're an independent retailer or a large industrial. And if you're a new developer of generation, you're ultimately dependent on the will of the gentailers to get your projects off the ground. It's not hard to make the changes that are needed to really unleash competition in New Zealand. We shouldn't be shy about doing it because we've seen the massive transformative impact that competition reform had in the telco sector, for example. We've seen that by splitting telecom into Chorus and Spark, that we actually got competition going, that as consumers we benefited from new products and much more competitive prices. And I'm sure all of you will share the appreciation for those changes, given that we went through COVID and relied on the internet so much during that period. So look, I think we've got a once-in-a-generation opportunity to think about how our market is designed. And really, the one thing stopping reform at the moment is political will.
Thank you very much to our panellists for those intro remarks that have raised lots and lots of issues, and I hope that we'll get the chance to dig into things like regulation and so on. But I'm going to start with the questions that are most popular coming through in Slido at the moment, and I'm going to group those under the umbrella of technological innovations. So I guess the broad question, and I'm going to address it to all of you, you can answer in the areas that you would most like to answer. What are the most promising technological innovations in the energy sector, since we're talking about innovation? And I've got a couple of specific questions that you may care to address under this. I'm not sure I completely understand all of these questions. I'm not an energy specialist, but I'll give them a go. First of all, how viable is hydrogen as a future energy source, including in a country like New Zealand? The second one was where I wasn't sure of my understanding. Are particle collision projects such as within CERN viable for us as a society? And if someone's going to answer that, if they can explain a little bit about what that means, I'd appreciate that. And then, of course, there's a more traditional one, wind power. Is it actually viable? Are there new technologies that will make that viable? So technological innovations, if you'd care to address some of those specific questions as well, great.
Sure. I think if you think about the energy transition, there are 3 things that are really critical, whether you're a generator or a retailer, a consumer, or a participant in the market somewhere. And they are electrons, data, and storage. Those are the 3 most critical things of the energy transition. Electrons, how do you produce them? Data, how do you make them most efficient within the system? And storage, electricity's big drawback is storage. Batteries help over hours. Gravity helps over days and weeks. But in terms of deep energy storage for a country like New Zealand that has long wind droughts and long rain droughts, that is one of our biggest challenges. So the different types of generation provide you electricity at different capacities across a year. So geothermal, for example, it generates 24/7, 365 days of the year. You can't turn it up, you can't turn it down, but it's brilliant in terms of providing you electricity at a set rate every day of the year. Hydro is fantastic over short periods of time, but it has long rain cycles in it, like we saw last winter. Wind generates electricity for about 40% of the year, solar for about 20% of the year. The challenge is everyone wants electricity for 100% of the year. And so how you store the different types of generation is really critical. Hydrogen as a storage fuel makes sense if you're over-generating a lot of electricity. Norway, for example, has decided to use its profits from its fossil fuel sales to the rest of the world to overbuild its hydro system. So it's decided to store all of its surplus energy for electricity in its hydro system. New Zealand doesn't have that choice. We don't have large fossil fuel sales to the rest of the world to fund that. We're also running out of places to put large-scale hydro. So our options are different to the rest of the world. In terms of the new generation types, particle collision, etc., nuclear fission, nuclear fusion, those are all relevant to how you might evolve your generation fleet going forward. Obviously, nuclear maps most closely to geothermal because it runs at a consistent speed all the time. So you've got to look at energy through electrons, how do you produce them, data, how do you make it most efficient in the network when they're produced, and then the third thing is storage, whether that's a battery on your house or Lake Pukaki in the South Island. Critical things to the transition.
Yeah. Just to build on that, one of the big opportunities which I mentioned is that demand side piece. So if we can, and there's actually lots of opportunity to shift people's usage around without impacting their lifestyle. So if you think about hot water control, we can do that over the smart meters currently by just shifting the usage of your hot water cylinder outside of the peak. That saves a couple of $100 and eliminates part of our peak problem. If we think about EVs, which is one of the big emerging demands, the way an EV is used will have a significant impact on whether it adds cost to our system or actually reduces the average cost of our system. So, for example, if you come home and you plug in at 5 o'clock, you're adding peak generation capacity, peak transmission, and peak network capacity. If we can shift that EV to charge off-peak, then we're avoiding those infrastructure costs. If we can shift its charging into when the wind is blowing or the sun's there, we really harness that intermittent renewables, and that's part of the equation for actually integrating more renewables into the mix. So the data piece and the consumer technology piece is actually an increasing opportunity for us to manage down cost.
I think from our perspective in the hard-to-abate sector, there's a number of opportunities of new technology that are being explored. But each of them has their own challenges. Economics is usually the one that comes to the fore pretty quickly. You mentioned hydrogen. I think we're the largest hydrogen producer in the country. We know what it's like to handle and make, but we make it from natural gas, which makes it affordable. But to do it from green electricity, it's expensive. We've also looked at biogas to potentially decarbonise the thermal heat process for our business. And just as an example, we looked at, I think you guys probably all have it here, the little green bins for food scraps. I know we got them in Auckland last year. I think at the moment they all get transported from Auckland down to Reparoa, put through a biodigester, the CO2 produced, which goes into helping turners and growers grow its vegetables, and the biogas is getting fed into the grid. Now, for all our food scraps in our biggest city in the country, that if we use that to produce methanol, we'd probably produce about 2,000 tonnes of methanol a year. Our plants have a capacity of about 2.2 million tonnes. So the scale difference is one of the big challenges when it comes to new technologies. Cost-wise, you're probably talking about 4 to 5 times the cost of conventional fuels. Now that's a hard pill to swallow, and I can't believe I've got this opportunity to quote Adam Smith at an economics forum, but it's not for the benevolence of the baker and the butcher and the brewer that puts your dinner on the table. It's self-interest. And the fact it's more expensive, until there's sort of encouragement around why people should pay more for something, it tends not to happen, whether we like that or not. And I'll maybe do a little bit of a segue back into the shipping sector that I mentioned earlier on. One of the things that I think's made a difference there around emission reduction is the fact that it's globally regulated by the IMO, or the International Maritime Organization. So that's a UN body that sets the rules for all shipping. Now, they're going down the carbon reduction path at the moment, but going back to, I'll probably get these dates wrong, but say 2008, they set some rules around reducing sulfur oxide and nitrous oxide emissions from shipping fuels. And the industry was up in arms about that and saying, we can't do it, it's too expensive, the fuels won't be there. But they set the date, for that transition. I think it was about 12 years in advance to say, these rules are happening. And there was bitching and moaning for 12 years around, this is never going to happen. Our self-interest, we want the cheapest fuels possible. But by having a global body that sets the rules where there's nowhere to escape, your insurance probably won't be valid if you don't comply with these rules. Come 2020, when those rules came in force, there was enough fuel, people paid for it, and nothing, I'll call it, there's no disruption to the shipping industry. And to me, that's one of the big differences when we talk about decarbonisation globally, is we don't have those global sets of rules. So there's holes galore, and there's that self-interest just eventuates in a number of forms. But one of them is trying to minimise your cost and minimise or maximise your profits, whether we like it or not.
It's interesting, actually. I was just reflecting, particularly during your comments, Malcolm, it's the third time in this economics forum in 3 different sessions I've heard the word nuclear mentioned, and I don't think I've heard it in any other economics forums that I recall, and I hope we don't hear it too much in the next session on geopolitics. But where I'd like to take this now is Minister Willis yesterday in her comments, she asked the question, are we well positioned to bring on board renewable energy, giving us security of supply and affordability? And that ties in with a very popular question that's coming through from our audience, which is that a vast amount of generation assets were built and funded by the government. Are we kidding ourselves that the private sector is going to fund investment in the new generation assets at a scale that's needed to enable abundant renewable energy? You look keen to start, Malcolm.
I'm happy to. I'm right in the heart of it. So I think the first thing that we've got to remember is, yes, the government did build a lot of these assets. It still owns 51% of most of them, and it sold at a top dollar and received cash for the rest of it. So it's willing buyer, willing seller in terms of how you've got to today. So I don't think the pathway to today is relevant to the future. What I would say is my observation of different energy transitions in different countries around the world, it's really, really obvious that those who have chosen a market-based transition are transitioning slower than those who chose an incentive-based transition. So if you put incentives in place for rooftop solar, if you put incentives in place for building new renewables, if you put incentives in place for building transmission and distribution networks, you are transitioning faster than those who chose a market-based transition. That was the importance of the second point I mentioned at the start. New Zealand has broad bipartisan support for a market-based economy. Our transition will occur at a different rate to incentivised economies. What we're seeing emerging in New Zealand is an expectation of an incentivised transition in a market-based economy. And they're 2 different speeds. There are things that we can do, and we should always continue to look at in terms of reform and enhancement to help the market deliver that better and faster. But if the expectation is that there will be irrational deployment of capital from the private sector to overbuild the supply side when the demand side is not growing, there's just no market in the world that shows you that it behaves like that. Because as Stuart said, most markets work on self-interest. It is, how do you deliver just in time to ensure that your costs are controlled and your profits are maximised? And that is the market-based mechanism that New Zealand has chosen for its energy transition. If we choose a different one, then that's fine. But I just think we've got to be careful we don't mix our drinks and have a set of expectations that don't match the structure we've chosen.
I think we could improve the flavour of the existing drink. So competition isn't working well as it is because we've got such a lock-up and that we've got far more dominance in our market than any other market. And I think we need to really mature the trading arrangements and the regulation around that so that that vertical integration piece doesn't become a blocker, because the obvious thing that's happening is you've got Malcolm and others who are rightly maximising for shareholder value, but we've got a position where actually the social benefit would be having more generation built out more quickly, and the economic signals are there, but those new generators can't get into market to build that generation because they're reliant on contracting with the big incumbents to make it happen, and we don't have some of the other kind of trading mechanisms and things in place in our market. So I think there's definitely things that we can do to improve the existing trading arrangements so that competition works better, because markets, in order for them to deliver competitive prices, really depend on that new entry. And if we can't get into the market currently, then we're just not going to get that lower cost, more efficient price signal that we need.
Stuart, I'm going to actually ask you a specific question that we've got coming through for you. Is there any interest in bioethanol made from forest resources?
Sorry, I missed that.
Is there any interest in bioethanol made from our forest resources?
Certainly biogenic carbon can be used in producing what we make. To me, it's the logistics of retrieving that and the economics of doing that, and the incentives to do it. So absolutely. As I said, we make biomethanol in the States from manure. It's probably slightly easier than what we have here, where the cows have been trained to poo in a slightly smaller area, and that intensified farming. Our farming with the free range makes that a little bit harder to collect, makes it more expensive. So we're exploring all those opportunities around the world, around how we can get that biogenic carbon and displace fossil carbon with that. Again, it's an immature industry, but we're exploring that around the world. What we probably find is we're not really incentivized to do that as much here as we are at other locations. Again, our signals around transitioning the gas industry were set 8 years ago when we said we didn't want gas. So to me, that's signaling that we're not really interested in a longer transition between gas and biogenic carbon fuels. So we're probably seeing more of a drive, more of an incentive globally in other locations than what we're seeing here, which I think is a real shame, because to me, I think there's a lot of potential in that biogenic carbon space here.
Can I just pick up on one point in terms of having a sole focus on shareholder returns? Genesis is in a really interesting position at the moment, in that as a result of the gas decline over the last 8 years, the country hasn't planned for that at all. And so we face a choice of whether we put some hundreds of millions of dollars of our working capital into a coal stockpile at Huntly to back up the entire energy system with no guarantee of ever being paid for that. So we have to put that in place long before New Zealand needs it. And if it rains and New Zealand doesn't need it, we can't get our hundreds of millions of dollars back, and the coal just sits there, which happened 4 years ago. What does that mean for Genesis? That is literally the choice between building a solar farm or having a coal stockpile. And there's no financial reward for us for doing that at the moment. So I utterly reject that Genesis acts solely in its shareholder interest. In fact, most of our shareholders tell us to stop doing that. But if we did, the lights would have gone out last winter. So I think it's a bit cheap to sort of take a shot that we don't act in the broader interests of the country.
And that's been very much in the news recently, hasn't it? So that was something that we appreciate your insights on that one. A rather more specific question on this, with the recent failure of Solar Zero, what does this mean to our market and continuous support of energy innovation?
Look, I think Solar Zero's collapse it's tragic to see, because they were doing lots of interesting things in the market, but there was quite a complicated business model behind it.
Right.
I think we do need to think about how we can, as I've talked about, harness distributed energy more in our system. It should play a really important part in the future, because if we think about, households moving to electric vehicles and how we cover that additional demand, it's a great solution for that. The Electricity Authority is currently consulting on some measures to improve buyback rates and provide more incentives for consumers to export into the market, which I think is quite interesting because we're already doing that as an independent retailer, and actually if they focused on competition settings, then we might get more of this innovation, we will get more of this innovation happening organically rather than them having to force it. But I think there's also things that the regulator will need to do around improving data and the access to data and the flow of it across the system to really enable a much more dynamic market going forward.
Genesis is the retail partner for 14,000 of Solar Zero's 15,000 customers in New Zealand. And so I just really want to reinforce what Margaret said. The critical, it was a complex structure, that's a corporate decision, but the critical element here is data and your ability to actually monetize the buyback and time of use element of rooftop solar. So I would argue that it was a great initiative, but the data immaturity of the electricity system really made it really difficult to make it profitable. We had 5% of all of our generation in January came from buybacks from customers from rooftop solar. The challenge for a lot of those customers is they don't have batteries, and in the wintertime they need to buy back off the grid at the most expensive time of the year. And so I think those time of use changes are really critical, but to have those, you need a level of data maturity that's not available in the electricity system at the moment.
I'm going to ask a quick question, maybe even a yes-no, and maybe you don't want to answer it, but it's the most popular question coming from the crowd at the moment, so and I'm sorry if I stimulated this with my previous comment. Is nuclear generation feasible in New Zealand from a scale point of view, politics aside? Do you have a brief response on this? Is it feasible if we put the politics aside?
I would only go to the point, I think it's one of the most expensive forms of electricity or energy generation. Self-interest will drive that, but to me it's why anything should not be on the table is beyond me. Because to me we need to embrace every solution because there's a lot of hard problems out there, and whether it's nuclear, whether it's carbon capture and storage, nothing should be off the table.
I don't have any insight to add.
Fair enough.
There was a really interesting survey done in Australia last year, and I can't recall right now where I saw it published, but those under 30 fear climate change more than they fear nuclear holocaust. And so the politics will change around nuclear as time goes by because the voters are going to change. I grew up in an era where my great threat or my great fear was the competition between the East and the West in the Cold War. So that conditioned my view of nuclear. For my children, my 3 children, they don't care or understand about that. Climate change is what matters to them. And if nuclear is a solution that helps them with climate change, that's their priority. So I think that it is moment in time stuff in terms of the politics, and I think it'll evolve.
And probably the technology maturing that it's at a scale that works for New Zealand, because typically nuclear you need huge amounts of demand, which New Zealand doesn't have yet. So.
Yeah.
And there's definitely a mindset change. I grew up next to a nuclear power station, a couple of miles down the road.
You can tell.
apart from the hair, no other effects.
It's interesting from my place up here. I was in the session when Brandon first mentioned it yesterday, and I agree with Veronica. There was a little ripple that went through the room, but there's not so many ripples. It's interesting. Let's put things on the table. We may not go there. There may be cost reasons we don't go there, but it's interesting that even within this conference, it seems that we've at least opened the door to some discussion about the issue, whether it makes sense. Right, we've got 1.5 minutes left, so we're going to have to go for a wrap question. I'm going to ask each of the 3 of you, key points, what's your main vision? What do we really need to do to get through the next 10 years of this transition? Can we get, where should we start? Let's.
As I said at the start, I think we're in a really enviable position with where our energy sector is here. To me, we've got an important role to play. We talk about leadership for the world, but how we do that transition, because to me, we're call it a key demonstration of how you do transition and how you transition well. So it's a lot of responsibility in that. And to me, as I said a few seconds ago, everything's got to be on the table. This isn't easy, and it's going to take a long time, and I think we've got to do a better job of bridging between ideological thinking and practical reality, because to me, politics have driven that in recent years more than they've ever done in the past. I've sit far more at the practical reality end, and I know we've still got a dream, but we've got to bridge that gap better than what we're doing at the moment.
If we want the market to work as well as it should, then we shouldn't be scared to put in place the regulatory arrangements that will make it work. So being able to, or requiring the gentailers to basically operate their businesses at arm's length, so it allows new parties to come in and compete, would be the first priority, I think, so that the market does what it should be doing in terms of when the price goes up, we see a response in terms of building new generation out so that price comes down, and equally bringing on that innovation from new players to harness that customer tech that's out there.
As Kiwis, we are way too hard on ourselves when it comes to renewable electricity, renewable generation, and way too soft on ourselves in terms of electrifying our economy.
Well, what did you think of that? I guess there's a lot of food for thought, and that's exactly what we want from these sorts of conferences. You know, when you said you used to live next to a nuclear power station, I did as well. But I was working with a bunch of wind engineers who couldn't understand why there weren't more complaints about the nuclear power station when there were so many complaints about the noise coming off their wind turbines. So there are all sorts of different perspectives on this. But you know, one of the ideas of this forum is to open it up. Have these conversations. We may or may not agree, but let's not have the silence when we mention these words that may not be within our own frame of thinking. But thank you to all of you for your contributions, for opening the discussion about regulation, about different forms of technology, and the steps that we need to do to make this transition. Unconstrained thinking. Thank you very much to our panel.
Thank you.